In New York City, among the glittering towers of Manhattan, Richard Thompson lived in a mansion that could have been mistaken for a palace. Everything about his life reflected power and success. Expensive art hung on the walls, crystal chandeliers sparkled in every room, and the garage housed luxury cars most people only saw in magazines. But behind all that wealth lay a deep emptiness, one that even his billions couldn't cure. His 10-year-old daughter Emma was the center of his world, yet she had never once taken a step. Emma had been born with a rare condition that left her unable to walk. From the moment she entered the world, Richard had promised his late wife, who had died during childbirth, that he would do anything to give their little girl the best life possible. And he did. He hired the finest doctors from Boston to Los Angeles, even flying specialists from Europe to examine her. He paid for surgeries, therapies, and experimental treatments that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Yet every time, the result was the same. She will never walk. The words haunted him. She will never walk. He repeated them in his head whenever he returned from another disappointing medical trip. Emma never complained. She sat quietly in her wheelchair, looking out the tall windows of their mansion at the garden where butterflies danced and flowers bloomed. But Richard knew she dreamed of running across the grass, of chasing the butterflies instead of watching them disappear. Beyond her reach, the guilt weighed on him like chains. Money was supposed to solve everything, yet he couldn't solve this. While Richard drowned himself in his work, expanding his empire of real estate investments, Emma spent most of her time with her nanny, Grace Miller. Grace was 32, a woman with gentle brown eyes and a calm voice that soothed Emma like no medicine ever could. Unlike the polished, sharp-tongued people who usually worked in the mansion, Grace was simple, humble, and kind. She had grown up in a small town in Ohio, and though she never had much, she carried herself with dignity. To her, Emma was not a patient or a responsibility. She was a child who deserved love. Every evening, when Richard stayed late at the office or locked himself in his study with paperwork, Grace sat by Emma's side. She read her fairy tales, her voice rising and falling like music, painting worlds where princesses didn't need to be. Rescued and heroes were not always kings. Emma loved those stories because, in Grace's words, she could imagine herself free, strong, and capable of more than doctors believed. Sometimes Grace would whisper prayers softly, asking for strength, healing, and hope. Emma listened, her little hands folded tightly as if her belief could turn prayers into miracles. But Grace's role went beyond reading and prayers. She began teaching Emma to imagine a future that nobody else dared to promise her. "Close your eyes," Grace would say gently, "and picture yourself walking through the garden. Feel the grass under your feet, the sun on your face." At first, Emma giggled, saying it was silly, but the more Grace repeated it, the more Emma started to believe, if only in her heart. She would smile and say, "One day, Grace, maybe one day." And for the first time in years, her laughter filled the mansion, even if Richard never stopped to listen. Richard thought of Grace as just an employee. He appreciated her reliability, but he never noticed the quiet magic she brought into Emma's world. To him, the nanny's role was simple: keep Emma safe, make sure she was fed, and manage her daily routines. The deeper things, joy, imagination, and hope, didn't matter in his mind. He believed that only science and medicine could save his daughter, and since they had failed, he accepted defeat. What he didn't realize was that Emma wasn't defeated at all, not with Grace by her side. On cold winter mornings, when snow blanketed the city and silence filled the rooms, Grace would wrap Emma in blankets and sit with her by the fireplace. They would talk about everything, about the stars, about places Grace dreamed of visiting, and about Emma's wish to one day ride a bicycle. "Do you think I could ever?" Emma once asked, her voice small but filled with longing. Grace smiled and touched her hand. "If you can dream it." "Emma, I believe you can. Nobody had ever told Emma that before. She carried those words like a secret treasure. Richard, meanwhile, drifted further from his daughter without realizing it. His grief and frustration hardened into a routine of avoidance. He would peek into Emma's room late at night, sometimes watching her sleep, but rarely stayed long enough to see her smile or hear her laugh. He thought he was protecting himself from disappointment. If he kept busy, if he focused on money, perhaps the ache in his heart would dull, but all it did was deepen. The distance between him and the only family he had left. Emma noticed. Children always do. She missed her father, though she never said it out loud. Instead, she poured her affection into Grace, who listened when she wanted to talk and held her when she wanted to cry. Grace became more than a nanny. She became Emma's closest friend, her own confidant, her light in the silence of the mansion. She told Emma stories of her own childhood, of climbing trees, running barefoot through fields, falling and scraping her knees, but always getting back up. Emma listened wide-eyed, as though Grace was describing a magical world she longed to touch. Yet beneath the laughter and the stories, Grace could see the longing in Emma's eyes. The child wanted freedom, not pity. She wanted to be seen as strong, not fragile. Grace understood something that Richard and the doctors did not. Sometimes healing starts with belief. She couldn't promise Emma she would walk, but she could give her something no one else had given: the courage to hope. And little by little, that hope began to grow, flickering like a flame in Emma's heart, waiting for the moment it would catch fire. One rainy afternoon, the skies over Manhattan were dark and heavy, the kind of storm that made the whole city feel quieter than usual. Richard Thompson had left his office early, something he rarely did. His driver pulled the black town car into the driveway of the mansion, the rain pattering against the glass like 1,000 whispers. Richard carried his briefcase inside, shaking off his umbrella, his mind still caught up in the numbers of a deal he had been negotiating. He expected the house to feel the same as always: cold, silent, and large. As he walked past the long hallway that led to Emma's playroom, a faint sound caught his attention. It wasn't the usual hum of the television or Grace's soft reading voice. It was different, sharp, alive, filled with something he couldn't quite place. Curiosity pulled him closer. When he reached the doorway, he stopped abruptly, his hand tightening on the doorframe. What he saw inside left him frozen, unable to breathe, unable to even blink. For years, he had seen his daughter only in her chair. But now, this was different. In the middle of the playroom, Grace was kneeling on the carpet, her face glowing with encouragement. She held Emma's small hands tightly, her eyes locked onto the girl's. "Push, sweetheart. Just one. More time," Grace whispered with gentle insistence. Emma's forehead was damp with effort, her little body trembling with determination. Slowly, carefully, she pressed her weight forward. For a moment, Richard thought she might collapse. But then, to his astonishment, Emma straightened her back, steadied her feet, and stood up. She was standing, unsupported, alive with energy. It lasted only a heartbeat, maybe two. Emma wobbled, her legs weak, and then she fell forward into Grace's arms. But she didn't cry. She didn't look defeated. Instead, her face lit up with joy that Richard had never seen before. Tears spilled from her eyes as she laughed, breathless but radiant. "Daddy, Daddy, I did it!" she shouted, her voice trembling with triumph. For the first time in her life, Emma wasn't just wishing for a miracle, she was living one. Richard's heart slammed in his chest. He stood frozen at the doorway, his throat tight, his eyes wide. For years he had listened to experts in pristine white coats, specialists who spoke with certainty and authority. They all said the same thing: impossible. They said his daughter's legs would never hold her weight, that her body was too weak, that walking was a dream too far away to touch. And yet here, she was standing, even if just for a moment, in the arms of a woman he had underestimated all along. His eyes filled with tears, hot and unstoppable. He gripped the doorframe to steady himself, feeling his knees weaken. How could this be? He had spent millions, flown across continents, begged the finest doctors for answers. But none of them gave him this moment. None of them gave Emma this chance. It wasn't science or money that had carried his daughter to her feet. It was something far simpler, far stronger, the power of faith, love, and persistence. Grace had given Emma what no money could buy: belief. Grace turned her head slightly then, her eyes catching sight of Richard in the doorway. She didn't look startled, only calm, as though she had expected this moment to come eventually. Richard stepped inside, his shoes sinking into the carpet, his breath shallow. He couldn't take his eyes off Emma. She sat on the floor now, still giggling, her cheeks flushed with joy. "Daddy." "I stood up," she repeated, her voice high with excitement. Richard knelt down beside her, his suit creasing against the floor, and for once he didn't care. His hands trembled as he cupped her face. "Yes, sweetheart," he whispered, his own tears breaking free. "I saw you. You did it." He kissed her forehead, holding her as if she were the most precious treasure in the world. Emma wrapped her small arms around his neck, still laughing, and in that embrace Richard felt something he hadn't in years: hope. For so long he had carried only sorrow, frustration, and guilt, but now hope bloomed inside him like sunlight after endless rain. His daughter wasn't broken, she wasn't trapped forever. She was fighting, and she was winning. Grace watched quietly, her heart swelling at the sight. She had never wanted recognition. Her only wish had been to see Emma believe in herself. But now, seeing Richard's face soften with love and wonder, she felt relief too. For months she had prayed that he would notice, that he would understand what Emma needed most wasn't more doctors or therapies, but faith. She had risked her job by pushing Emma this way, afraid Richard might see it as false hope. But tonight proved that hope was the very thing Emma needed. The storm outside roared, lightning flashing across the windows, thunder shaking the air. Yet inside the room, it felt like the world had shifted to something gentler. Richard pulled Emma into his lap, hugging her tightly as though afraid she might vanish if he let go. "I'm so proud of you," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Emma looked at him with shining eyes, her little voice soft but steady. Grace said, "A good daddy. She believed in me." Richard turned toward Grace then, and for the first time he truly saw her. She wasn't just the nanny. She wasn't just an employee he paid to keep his daughter safe. She was the woman who had given his daughter the courage to do the impossible. He stared at her, words catching in his throat, his mind racing back over the years. He had wasted years. He had been blind to the quiet, persistent miracle unfolding under his own roof. Grace held his gaze, her expression humble, almost apologetic, but she didn't need to explain. The truth was written in Emma's laughter, in the miracle Richard had just witnessed with his own eyes. Silence stretched between them for a moment, broken only by Emma's happy giggles. Then Richard stood, still holding his daughter close. He walked across the room to Grace, his voice low, trembling, with sincerity. "Thank you," he said simply. The words felt small compared to what she had done, but they carried the weight of his heart. Grace shook her head softly, her smile faint. "Don't thank me. Thank her," she whispered, nodding at Emma. "She's the one who chose to fight." But Richard knew the truth. Emma had found her courage because Grace believed when no one else would. As the night wore on, the storm began to fade, the rain softening into a drizzle. Inside the mansion, however, everything had changed. Richard no longer saw his daughter as fragile, no longer saw her condition as an unbreakable prison. He saw possibility, he saw strength, and most of all, he saw the bond between Grace and Emma, a bond built not on duty, but on love. It humbled him, reminding him that the greatest miracles often grow quietly, unnoticed, until the day they finally reveal their power. That night, Richard vowed never to look away again. The very next week, something shifted inside Richard Thompson's mansion. For years, it had been a house of polished silence, where wealth glistened in every corner, but warmth was scarce. Now it was filled with laughter, determination, and the sound of tiny footsteps trying to defy fate. Richard cancelled all his business trips and meetings, much to the shock of his associates. For the first time in decades, his empire wasn't his top priority. His daughter was. Every morning, he rose early, no longer rushing into conference calls, but waiting eagerly for Emma's daily exercises with Grace. Grace's methods were unlike anything Richard had seen in the clinics or hospitals. There were no cold machines, no sterile environments, no charts with predictions. Instead, she used games, songs, laughter, and small challenges. Sometimes, she asked Emma to reach for her favorite toy just a step away. Other times, she held her hands loosely, letting Emma wobble, fall, and get back up again. Progress was slow, but it was real. Richard, who had once measured life in numbers and profits, now measured it in seconds. Emma stayed standing, in steps she took before collapsing into giggles. The mansion's halls, once echoing with emptiness, now resounded with encouragement. Richard often found himself clapping wildly at something as simple as Emma walking 2 steps forward. Grace's voice was steady and calm, always reminding Emma to trust herself. 1 more try, sweetheart, don't be afraid to fall. Falling just means you're moving forward. Emma listened with wide, shining eyes, never doubting Grace's belief in her. Richard marveled at the way Grace transformed fear into courage. She didn't see Emma as fragile. She saw her as strong, and because of that, Emma began to believe it too. As the days passed, Richard began to see changes not just in Emma, but in himself. He was learning patience, something his business life had never taught him. He no longer barked orders or chased results. Instead, he celebrated each small victory with tears in his eyes, humbled by the resilience of a 10-year-old girl. There were nights he would sit alone in his study, remembering the years wasted chasing specialists and treatments, blinded by his obsession with control. He realized now that love, not money, had been the missing ingredient all along. Then came the day that would be etched into his memory forever. The sun was shining bright, the storm of the previous week a distant memory. Grace suggested they take Emma into the garden, where the soft grass would cushion her falls. Emma's wheelchair was rolled out, but she insisted on standing, her small hands gripping Richard's tightly at first. Grace knelt beside her, whispering encouragement, while Richard, nervous but hopeful, let her hand go. With trembling determination, Emma took one shaky step, then another, her bare feet pressing into the cool earth. She wobbled, nearly stumbled, but kept moving forward. Richard watched, his heart pounding louder than it ever had in a boardroom. His daughter, who had never taken more than a few supported steps, was now walking toward him, barefoot in the garden. Her arms stretched out, her face glowing with joy. Step by step, she closed the distance, until finally she collapsed into his embrace, laughing breathlessly. Richard broke down, his tears soaking her hair as he whispered over and over, "You did it, baby. You did it." It was the moment he had prayed for, the miracle he had thought impossible. In that instant, wealth, success, and reputation meant nothing. Richard would have traded every penny of his fortune just to feel his daughter's heartbeat against his chest as she stood on her own 2 feet. Grace watched from a few steps away, her own tears falling silently. She had always believed Emma could do it, but seeing it happen, watching the little girl she loved conquer the impossible, was beyond even her deepest hopes. The sight of Richard, crying openly, holding his daughter like she was the world itself, only deepened the moment's beauty. Later that evening, as the sunset painted the sky gold and pink, Richard called Grace into his study. Emma was asleep upstairs, exhausted from her triumph. Richard, his voice thick with emotion, told Grace he wanted to reward her in the only way he knew how. He offered her wealth beyond imagination, a house, a car, a lifetime of financial security. He wanted to give her everything money could buy. Grace listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes calm. When he finished, she shook her head softly and smiled. "I don't need riches, Mr. Thompson. I just wanted Emma to believe." Richard stared at her, humbled once again. He had spent so many years surrounded by people who wanted something from him. Investors, partners, acquaintances drawn to his wealth. But Grace wanted nothing except Emma's happiness. It struck him that her strength didn't come from ambition, but from love. For the first time in his life, Richard felt truly small, stripped of the illusion that money could solve everything. He realized then that Grace had given him something no fortune could purchase, the miracle of hope. Inspired, Richard made a decision. If love and belief could help Emma walk, then they could surely help countless other children too. He proposed to Grace that they start something bigger, a foundation, dedicated to helping children with disabilities find strength and confidence regardless of wealth. Grace hesitated at first, unsure if she was worthy of leading such a cause. But Richard assured her that she was the heart behind it all, and without her, there would be no foundation. Together, they envisioned programs filled not just with therapy, but with encouragement, patience, and love. Soon, Richard redirected his resources, not into expanding his empire, but into building hope. The Thompson Foundation was born, with Grace as its heart and soul. Children from across New York came, some from wealthy families, others from neighborhoods that had never seen opportunity. Each one carried their own struggle, but within the foundation's walls, they were given more than medical attention, they were given belief. Emma became the living symbol of what was possible, her story spreading far beyond the mansion's walls. Newspapers called it a miracle, but Richard knew better. It wasn't a miracle, it was love. As months passed, Emma grew stronger, running barefoot through the same garden where she had once taken her first steps. Richard often sat watching, his eyes misty, remembering the child who once only stared longingly at the world through her window. Now her laughter filled the air, her joy infectious. Grace remained by her side as both a mentor and a friend, her bond with Emma unshakable. Richard, no longer saw Grace as just a nanny. She had become family, the person who had brought life back into both Emma's body and his own weary soul. Word of Emma's transformation spread throughout New York, inspiring countless families who had long given up hope. Doctors, therapists, and experts all marveled, but Richard no longer cared about their approval. He knew the truth. Money could buy treatment, but only love could create miracles. He often repeated that phrase at charity galas, his voice breaking as he shared his daughter's story. People listened not to the millionaire, but to the father who had learned that the most valuable currency in the world was love. And every time he looked at Emma running free, he knew he would never forget it.